Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be reading this afternoon from a book that was published in 2022, Personality and Power, Builders and Destroyers of Modern Europe, by Ian Kershaw, who is a distinguished British historian. He's a German historian and has written perhaps the very best biography of Adolf Hitler. And it's a 2-volume work, and it's highly recommended. And I should note, for that work and many other teaching honors and so on, this is not just Ian Kershaw, it's Sir Ian Kershaw. So I'm going to read today the essay in this book about Winston Churchill, Britain's war hero. Probably no politician in European democracy has wielded more power than Winston Churchill did between 1940 and 1945. Certainly none has had such accolades bestowed on him. He has frequently been portrayed as the quintessence of historical greatness, the savior of his nation, even more the savior of liberty in the Western world. The force of personality has seldom, if ever, been elevated to such a determining role in history, in a positive way, as contrasted with the catastrophic impact of the personality of dictators. Yet Churchill was, in the main, a political failure before 1940. And his leadership in the decades after 1945, the years of political opposition until 1951, then as prime minister again until 1955, would not have resulted in the effusions of undiluted praise for a political titan had it not been for what preceded them. The assessment of personality and power depends heavily in this case, therefore, on the judgment of Churchill's role during the Second World War. No one was more aware of this than Churchill himself, who consciously sought to shape the way posterity would view his wartime leadership in his 6-volume war memoirs. The Second World War, published between 1948 and 1954, reached a global readership of millions. It was in the exceptional conditions of British democracy at war that Churchill's personality played a vital role. The personal qualities before the war had so often proved ineffective, and after the war were subordinated to economic and geopolitical determinants that Churchill was unable to control, and which were tailor-made for the emergency conditions of the war. They operated in a democracy, though one transformed by crisis into an unusually malleable vehicle for the leadership of commanding personality. Churchill was extremely egotistical, highly opinionated, with an innate self-confidence typical of the British aristocracy into which he had been born. His social background also gave him a strong sense of duty and purpose, with that inbred feeling of entitlement and authority that belonged to a member of the ruling elite. His temperament exuded belligerence. He instinctively looked to aggressive, not defense. He was resolute and ruthless, physically courageous. He was given to bold, quick decisions, a characteristic that had long brought him the reputation of being reckless, of lacking sound judgment. He possessed unshakable self-belief, a restless disposition, and ingrained authoritarian tendencies. He used his sharp wit and quick, often sarcastic repartee to cutting effect in debate, and it took much to counter his strength of conviction and power of persuasion. His innate energy and dynamism were accompanied by impatience and outbursts of bad temper. Even his wife Clementine felt it necessary in 1940 to upbraid him for his rough, sarcastic, and overbearing manner, his irascibility and rudeness. But he could also be generous-spirited and magnanimous. He evoked deep affection and loyalty to those around him. Action this day became the watchword, and it was his watchword above all. He drove the government relentlessly forward. With everything subordinated to the war effort, the scope of agencies of democratic control and the executive power of the government through parliamentary scrutiny and especially public opinion was curtailed. Parliament, of course, still sat. Cabinet committees met. Newspapers appeared. The radio was more important than ever. But censorship, official, and even more important perhaps, self-censorship, meant the suppression or omission of anything sounding unpatriotic. As the main body of government, the cabinet met regularly, but Churchill wasted cabinet time by not reading relevant papers beforehand or making verbose disquisitions on something that had just caught his eye. The crucial decisions were taken by a small war cabinet, at first only of 5 members, later 8. Churchill was the dominant figure, quickly and completely asserting his authority. He listened to advice and off it took it. There was a widely held and justified view, nevertheless, that he was over-dependent on the counsel of 2 personal cronies, Lord Beaverbrook, in charge of war production, and Brendan Bracken, Minister of Information, who did not belong to the War Cabinet. There was also resentment at the strong influence of his chief scientific advisor, Professor Frederick Linneman, an Oxford physics professor. Wartime crisis management gave full rein to his inbuilt dictatorial tendencies. What had once been seen as impulsive or reckless can now be regarded as decisive and dynamic. As defense minister as well as prime minister, the direction of the war was his domain. Foreign affairs were in principle the business of Anthony Eden, appointed foreign secretary in December 1940 to replace Lord Halifax, who was dispatched to Washington as British ambassador. In practice, however, Churchill effectively ran foreign policy. He was little interested in domestic affairs and depended here heavily on the labor politicians he incorporated in his government. Clement Attlee, the labor leader and highly efficient coordinator of home affairs, Ernest Bevin, whom Churchill appointed to the key position of Minister of Labor, and Herbert Morrison from October 1948, Home Secretary and Minister of Home Security. The vital work they carried out on the home front gave Churchill the freedom to devote his copious energies to running the war. His strategic thinking was, however, often flawed and needed the corrective of his service chiefs. In the second half of the war, his power declined as he was forced to yield increasingly to American imperatives, both in strategic and in geopolitical planning. In fact, when it came to the Big Three conferences that were to lay down the post-war order in Europe, the real power was wielded by neither Churchill nor Roosevelt, but by the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. What counted was less personality than military realities. Winston Churchill was born on 30 November 1874 at Blenheim Palace near Oxford. The palace had been granted to his illustrious ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, whose biography he would write, following the famous victory over the French at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, rose to be Chancellor of the Exchequer and was regarded as a future Prime Minister until recklessness and political mistakes ended his career. He died in 1895, aged only 45, probably of a syphilis-related illness. Winston's American-born mother, Jenny Jerome, a socialite of noted beauty, had a number of lovers, including the Prince of Wales, and 2 further marriages after the death of Lord Randolph, dying in 1921. His parents were distant figures who placed career and socializing before the relationship with their son and his younger brother Jack. Winston sought love and attention in his sad and plaintive letters home during his unhappy years away in boarding school. His behavior at Harrow, one of England's leading public schools, was unruly and his academic performance undistinguished. Most of his letters went unanswered. What replies he did receive were cold and dismissive. It was an appalling emotional cruelty. Winston nevertheless drew close to his mother over the years. His father he idolized, though he tried in vain to win his approval. The need to emulate, then surpass his father's achievements, stayed with him. Late in life, he was still justifying himself to the dead father, who had been convinced that his son would be a failure. The 45 years that followed his father's death down to 1940 were indeed hardly an unqualified success. As a young Army officer and war correspondent, Winston was keen to see action and became well known after escaping from captivity during the Boer War. After entering politics in 1899, his precocious talent was quickly recognized, and he had the connections in high places to further his advances. In 1907, he was prophesying that he would be prime minister in little over a decade. Already the previous year, he had become a government minister as Undersecretary of State for the Colonial Office in the Liberal administration. And as a devotee of free trade, he had defected in 1904 from the Conservative Party over the introduction of tariffs on goods imported from outside the empire. He joined the cabinet as president of the Board of Trade in 1908, was Home Secretary in 1910, and First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, a post he particularly cherished. In 1917, he was appointed Minister of Munitions. In 1919, the Secretary of State for War and Air, and briefly in 1921-22, Secretary of State for the Colonies. Between 1924 and 1929, he held the high office of Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Conservative administration, which he had rejoined when he had rejoined the Conservatives in 1924. His long years in government before entering opposition at the defeat of the Conservatives in the general election of 1929 had given him unusually wide experience. But accusations of lack of judgment dogged him. Stanley Baldwin, 3 times prime minister between 1924 and 1937, had privately remarked, "When Winston was born, lots of fairies swooped down on his cradle with gifts, imagination, eloquence, industry, ability. And then came a fairy who said, 'No person has a right to so many gifts,' picked him up and gave him such a shake and a twist that with all those gifts, he was denied judgment and wisdom." The view that Churchill, though possessing great ability, lacked sound judgment was widely held and followed him throughout most of his life. He seemed likely until the dramatic shift in external circumstances in the late 1930s to be unable to attain what he always wanted, which was to be Prime Minister of Britain. His headstrong temperament had indeed contributed to serious mistakes. He had stepped down from his cherished post as First Lord of the Admiralty, humiliated by the heavy responsibility he bore for the ill-fated naval operations to force a passage through the Dardanelles in 1915, the prelude to the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, which led to over 100,000 casualties. A conservative newspaper described him that year as a danger to the country. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, his decision in 1925 to return to the gold standard was widely seen then and later to have been economically damaging. And Churchill later came even to agree with his critics that he'd been a poor chancellor. The rich promise of his early years had not been fulfilled. Nothing suggested, even so, that he would be out of government for an entire decade. His years in the wilderness, as he called them, seemed to mark the end of a career that had begun with such high expectations. He was at least able to devote more time to writing, which included work on the 4th volume of his Marlborough biography, and to his numerous hobbies such as painting, bricklaying, and beekeeping. Even without his ministerial salary, his prolific literary output earned him a sizable income, but his extravagant lifestyle and the cost of maintaining and renovating of the house and the estate at Chartwell in Kent, his home since early 1920s, of lavish entertainment, of the salaries of 14 serving staff, and of upkeep of his family, his wife Clementine and their 4 but now grown-up expensive offspring, meant that he had no difficulty in spending the money he made, and more besides. Central to Churchill's character was his sense of history. As a sign of the English aristocracy, steeped in the values of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, he saw history as the progress of human civilization that had reached its apogee in Britain's parliamentary institutions and in the British Empire, at its height as he approached adulthood. In some ways, he belonged more to the 19th century than to the 20th century. He imbibed as a schoolboy the deeds of great heroes in England's past who had led Britain to preeminence. His belief in the empire was the cornerstone of all that he did, defense of the empire his key motivating force. He shared the views of most people at the time, and certainly of the ruling class, that the white race was superior to the natives of the empire towards whom he felt a sense of paternalistic duty. Throughout his life, he regularly used racist expressions that future generations would regard as repellent. His already dated imperialistic mentality lay behind his die-hard rejection of even limited constitutional reform in India, which put him at odds with most of the Conservative Party. He was again on the wrong side of government orthodoxy in his strong backing for Edward VIII of the abdication crisis of 1936. But what chiefly brought him mounting unpopularity was his repeated demand for urgent, extensive rearmament. The information reached him from a number of unofficial but reliable confidential sources on the scale of German rearmament disturbed him deeply. His warnings fell largely on deaf ears, however. The government, mostly backed by the opposition, moved from the policy of disarmament to one of appeasement. It belatedly backed rearmament almost at the last moment. No one doubted Churchill's eloquence, but his speeches in the House of Commons condemning British defense policy were ineffective. His views remained those of a small minority. His speech and debate that followed Chamberlain's return in seeming triumph from the Munich Conference in 1938, at which Britain yielded to Hitler's demand for the annexation of the state and region of Czechoslovakia, was delivered to a mainly hostile House of Commons. Churchill's denunciation of Nazi Germany had been consistent since Hitler's takeover of power in 1933, and his early admiration for Mussolini dissolved as fascist Italy allied itself with Germany. His long-standing hatred of Bolshevism had by the late 1930s given way to a recognition that a Soviet alliance was necessary to counter appeasement and to prevent war. But his advocacy of a grand alliance that included the Soviet Union was in vain. Only when the German occupation of the rump of what had been Czechoslovakia in March 1939 did the recognition dawn in Britain that war in Europe was almost certain, and that Churchill had been right all along about the danger posed by Hitler. On 3 September 1939, the day of British declaration of war in Germany, Churchill was recalled to government, once again as First Lord of the Admiralty, the post he had left in humiliation nearly a quarter of a century earlier. Had he died before 1939, Churchill might well have been known as the man who got the Royal Navy ready for the Great War. More likely, he would have been best remembered for the Dardanelles disaster. Churchill certainly introduced new energy and a sense of urgency into naval planning. It was unlikely, however, that he would replace Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. He had become an outsider in his own party. And as late as July 1939, 4/5 of Conservative backbench members of Parliament did not even want him in the cabinet. Even after he had returned to government at the start of the war, senior figures in Whitehall thought his lack of judgment ruled him out as a future prime minister. Churchill, however, was instinctively drawn to power. He saw himself as a man of destiny. On the moment he was appointed prime minister, he later wrote, "It felt as if I were walking with destiny, that all my past life had been a preparation for this hour." It was, however, chance, not destiny, that brought him to the premiership in 1940. Chance operated, though within a structural framework determined by the sharp deterioration in international relations during the preceding 2 decades. The rise of German power, the growing threat from Japan and the Far East, and Britain's imperial overreach in maintaining defense spending and facing colonial independence movements, policies of disarmament, and then, when they had obviously failed, appeasement were shaped by this context. What had begun under Baldwin had been pursued by his successor, Neville Chamberlain, to the point at which Britain's political, economic, and military weakness had been laid bare and the threat to the country was all too obvious. Churchill's consistent opposition, which had brought him so many brickbats during the 1930s, was now lauded as prophetic. Attitudes towards him were starting to change. Nevertheless, there was no great threat to Chamberlain's primacy during the strange months of the so-called phony war from the fall of 1939 until May of 1940. He was still extremely popular within the Conservative Party, and the structures of power that supported his premiership remained intact. It needed more than just the failed appeasement policy to topple him from power. Change came from an unexpected turn of events. Chamberlain's foolish remark on 4 April 1940 that Hitler had missed the bus by not invading France and Britain quickly came back to bite him. 5 days later, German troops invaded and swiftly overran Denmark and Norway. This preempted British plans, which Churchill had strongly promoted, to mine Norwegian waters in order to cut off German iron ore supplies being shipped from Narvik. Initial naval battles, with losses on both sides, were the prelude to a disastrous land campaign in northern Norway that ended ignominiously with the evacuation of Allied troops. Tactical mistakes, organizational problems, and intelligence failures all played their part. There was much rancor within the British military command, and much of it rightly directed at Churchill, the architect of the Narvik expedition. Some advocated his dismissal. Had that occurred, any chance of succeeding Chamberlain would have been, it would have disappeared. As it was, public fury at the debacle largely bypassed Churchill and turned on the head of the government and on Chamberlain himself. The heated debate on Norway in the House of Commons on 7-8 May saw Chamberlain under fire as never before. The entire debate centered on the question of confidence in the Prime Minister, and the humiliation in Norway was now linked to the long-term failures of the government. Strategic errors on rearmament and appeasement, with the effect that the spotlight was deflected from Churchill's role in the Norwegian campaign. Explicit demands were made for a change of leadership. Churchill remained overtly loyal towards Chamberlain, but his friends in the House sang his praises. The government won the vote, though 41 Conservatives voted against the government and around a further 50 abstained. It was a fatal moral defeat for Chamberlain. It quickly became clear that he had no way out. Only the timing of his resignation and the question of his successor remained open. It was far from certain that his successor would be Churchill. In fact, at first it appeared unlikely that he would succeed. Some in the House of Commons even spoke of the possibility of recall of David Lloyd George, who had been Prime Minister during the First World War. That was wild talk. The favorite to become the next prime minister was, however, not Churchill, but Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. Halifax was preferred by Chamberlain and most of the Conservative Party. Labour opposition leaders who rejected any participation in a government led by Chamberlain had made it plain that they were ready to serve in a Halifax administration. An obvious problem was that Halifax had no seat in the House of Commons. Though neither Chamberlain nor King George VI, who had also favored Halifax, saw that as an insuperable obstacle. The bigger issue was whether Halifax actually wanted to be prime minister. The very thought of it gave him stomach aches. He was acutely aware of his lack of military expertise and feared he would be little more than a cipher in an administration dominated by Churchill, who would take charge of defense and would in practice be running the war effort anyway. Halifax's diffidence, or was it a hidden calculation that Churchill was bound to fail, and Churchill's assertiveness proved decisive. Halifax did not want the heavy responsibility. Churchill wanted nothing more. So when Chamberlain visited Buckingham Palace on the afternoon of 10 May 1940 to tender his resignation as Prime Minister to George VI, it was to recommend Churchill, not Halifax, to assume the highest office in the land. 4 men at the time, Chamberlain, Churchill, Halifax, and the chief whip in the House of Commons, David Margison, had between them determined who would lead Britain in the worst crisis the country had ever faced. Britain's history, indeed, the history of Europe and the Western world, would have been very different had Lord Halifax, not Churchill, directed the country's fortunes that year. Halifax had many qualities, but as he himself recognized, they were not those of a war leader. He would not have been a suitable prime minister in 1940. His modest, self-effacing character and coolly rational manner would in many circumstances have been regarded as significant attributes. At the time of the great national crisis, however, they were not what was needed. Halifax lacked the capacity to inspire, and he had been a central figure in the government that had pursued the failed policy of appeasement. Churchill, in contrast, was now seen generally to have had been right all along, and has largely isolated frontal opposition to that policy. His ebullience, indomitable spirit of defense, and pugnacious dynamism were precisely what was required to uphold the then raised morale when the outlook was at its bleakest. He had the capacity to instill hope. His emotional patriotism, expressed in his inimitable oratory, magnificent cadences, literary flourishes of somewhat archaic language, and proved inspirational. Rational assessment and cool analysis could not match it in the prevailing circumstances. Churchill's traits of character had at times during his long career been a handicap, but at this juncture, his personality was, in fact, decisive. It is hard to conceive of worse conditions in which, at the age of 65, Churchill assumed power. The German offensive in Western Europe began the very day that he was appointed prime minister, 10 May 1940. Advancing with breakneck speed towards the English Channel. Within 2 weeks, Holland had surrendered, Belgium was on the verge of doing so, and the fall of France was looking certain. Britain's main continental ally, up till now still reckoning to be a great power, was facing calamitous defeat. By 25 May, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped as it fell back on Dunkirk. The military leadership offered little hope of evacuation. The army and its equipment were presumed largely lost. Even worse was contemplated. British intelligence thought a German invasion probably in the near future. Establishing air superiority was deemed to be the only real chance of avoiding it. Never had Britain stood in such extreme peril. Voices of despondency, if not outright defeatism, could be heard among those fully aware of the dire situation. There was talk of the final defeat of Britain, the end of the British Empire, that everything was finished. As the great crisis raged, Churchill was not as dominant as he would soon become. He himself plainly recognized his dependence on Chamberlain, who remained the leader of the Conservative Party until his death from cancer in November, and also on Halifax, kept on as Foreign Secretary. The other members of the small war cabinet that Churchill had immediately set up on becoming Prime Minister were the Labour leader Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, Deputy Labour leader. Archie Sinclair, the Liberal leader and Secretary of State for Air, was sometimes invited to attend. It was here that arguably the most critical decisions in British history took place in late May 1940. At stake was whether Britain would take soundings about a possible negotiated peace or would, despite its evident military weakness, fight on. It was a question at this extraordinarily perilous moment, not of fighting on to final victory, but of holding out and hoping that Britain's fortunes would improve over the coming months. Discussion on whether to seek terms went on at the War Cabinet during the succession days between 25 and 28 May. Lord Halifax favored exploring Italian brokerage of a peace conference, possibly leading to a negotiated settlement to end the war. Some territorial concessions, including perhaps Malta, Gibraltar, and Suez, would doubtless be necessary, though if Britain did not like the terms, Halifax argued he could always reject them. Halifax was as patriotic as Churchill. Like Churchill, he aimed to preserve British independence, but coolly rationalizing Britain's military weakness, he looked not unreasonably to a diplomatic solution. Churchill's temperament was entirely different. He spoke with passion and emotion, instinctively favoring defiance and readiness to fight on in the hope that America would come to Britain's aid before it was too late. Still, he blended emotion with reasoned judgment. Any approach to Mussolini would undermine Britain's fighting potential, he declared. Hitler would be sure to impose terms which would be drastically weaken Britain. None that might be offered would be acceptable. The country still possessed the power to resist. Showing Hitler that he could not conquer or break Britain was the only sensible option. To fight and be defeated would result in no worse terms than were currently on offer. He rejected Halifax's approach, therefore as futile and dangerous. Discussion was at times heated, and Halifax himself thought Winston talked the most frightful rot and despaired at his passion of emotion when he ought to make his brain think and reason. But that wasn't Churchill's way. Only a week after the conclusion of these momentous debates in the War Cabinet, the evacuation from Dunkirk was completed, beyond all expectations, and when all had been thought lost, 338,000 French, British, and Belgian troops were brought across the Channel, and on 4 June, Churchill could report the miracle of deliverance at Dunkirk in the House of Commons. His patriotic, defiant speech became justly famous. He succeeded in turning a humiliating defeat into a national triumph. His own standing soared. His authority as Britain became unchallenged, the unchallenged war leader, and being that war leader, he was recognized as supreme. There are few instances where the impact of personality and decisions of vital consequence is so clearly demonstrated. Had Lord Halifax, a man of ability and intelligence and utmost integrity, as anxious as Churchill to do the best for his country, been Prime Minister in May 1940, Britain's fortunes would surely have been altogether different. Pursuing terms to end the war would have been tantamount to a defeat. The morale of the population would have sunk like a stone. Hitler, as Churchill argued, would have posed damaging terms in any settlement guaranteed to ensure Britain's permanent subordinate status. A reasonable speculation is Britain's fate would have been similar in fashion to those of France following the armistice signed on 27 June. Independence and freedom would have been lost. Britain would have become, in effect, a satellite of Germany. An extraordinary reading, and I would add this personal note. I have walked into Westminster Abbey in London on many occasions, and what always brings me to tears, I do mean that sincerely, brings me to tears, is the great piece of black granite that sits just inside the entrance to the Abbey. And on that big piece of black granite is written, "Thank God for Winston Churchill." Thank you.